Hey everybody, this is our last video for the week, for week one, and what we're looking at today is how to work through an FRQ, right? In this case, we're looking at how we think through an FRQ, right? How we think through a stimulus. So we looked at breaking down different sources, we looked at breaking down different stimuli, right? Early stimuli based on different topics, right? One for the EPA, one for the for a map of China and population density. And so here we're going to focus in on that because we've been focusing on that topic this week, population densities, and we're going to talk about exactly how these questions work, right? Or at least my mindset going into reading through these questions. Right? So here we have a map, right, of population density. And we're looking at population density per square kilometer. It's a world map, right? So at the very least, right, the things I want to keep in mind is that I'm looking at an international scale, right? I'm looking at multiple countries. In this case, I am looking at the entire world. And what that means for me is that there's going to have to be some focus that I have, right? I'm going to have to think about some things in specific because the whole world is a lot to think about. And I may get asked questions about patterns, right? Distributions, consistencies that are in this map. So I'm going to look for maybe what I would call concentrations, right? Or clusters. Maybe those are going to be what I want to focus in on. And I would think about that answer and I think about what that might look like. I can see a number of different clusters, or I'm looking at my choropleth map here. Right here I have my different shades. So what I'm really thinking about here is where are my darkest shades located, right? Where do I see the most darkest shades here located on the map? Now I see a lot of variety of shades, right? Some lighter, some in the middle, some in between. It doesn't look like the U.S. is U.S., Mexico are pretty consistent, but it's at the low end, right? South America, most of Africa, these are also on the lower end of things, but I do have these other big clusters that I can see right throughout this text, or throughout this map rather. So I can see for sure that I have these areas here. All right, if I think about where these areas are located, right, I have these spaces where I can find myself, right, and locate the variety of different clusters that are available to me. So I definitely see one here, right? Here in India, here we have Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, and this is my South Asian concentration, right? So South Asia is one of these big population concentrations. I can also see here in East Asia, right, Japan and the Koreas, the Philippines, eastern parts of China, right? So East Asia is also a big cluster of lots of people. I can see as well Southeast Asia, right? Indonesia, Vietnam, etc. And my last one here in Europe, and not just all of Europe, right? We have this divide here, but it looks like Western Europe is going to take the cake, is going to have the highest concentration, right? And these are our 4 population concentrations, right, in the world. Now, aside from this, I want to start thinking about other big connections, right? This is just population, but that's not all it has to do with, right? Population has to get there somehow, right? These growth rates happen for a reason and happen for related factors. In this case, if I'm looking at South Asia, East Asia, West Asia, I want to think of my trend in general, right? I want to think about maybe how developed these regions are, right? Because that's also going to inform me about the population growth and why the population maybe is as concentrated as it is. So in South Asia, with India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, these areas are mostly newly industrialized countries, right? These are NICs, right? And that's going to mean a bunch of different things for my chart, right? So I can come back and say, well, I want to think about my chart, how my chart's going to work for me. And generally what that's going to mean is that I have an idea, right, of what interrelationships happen between these countries, right? Because it's not just about being an MDC and NIC and MDC, right? But I do have these connections, right? My LDC, my list of other countries. I know I can talk about my sectors of the economy because that could affect, right, jobs and education and things like that. All right, so here I'm in that tertiary sector. Right, we're tertiary sector, we're concerned with services. My newly industrialized countries, in that secondary sector, where I'm concerned with manufacturing and industry. And my less developed countries, where I'm focused on the primary sector, right? Raw material sourcing, or collection. Right? Outside of that, I can also think of my DTM, my demographic transition model, which we'll focus on next week in more specifics or more specificity. But this is a good prelude to that, a good preface to have. Because my DTM for my MDCs, right, we use stage 4 and 5 in the DTM. For my NICs, will be in stage 3. The LDCs, stage 2, and stage 1, right? But we don't have any stage 1s, right? But it falls into that category. Now, aside from this, and I'm thinking about these population concentrations, what I have to start having in mind is how these different factors, these different relationships in development may impact this population density, right? Why is it so dense in these areas compared to others? Well, one of the facts is going to be just the fact that there are lots of people in these places, right? And the difference here between maybe having lots of people and not is that this density relationship is always going to be relative between the number of objects related to the amount of space, right? And so that's how we're going to get our density, right? So we may have 50 people per 1 square kilometer, right, or 1 square mile, or if we're thinking about the non-metric systems, and that'll be our density. That's pretty high, right? Having 50 people per 1 square mile, because we could also have a different density where we have maybe 1 person per square mile, right? A very sparse place, a very dispersed population distribution. That doesn't seem to be what we have here, right? We have these density measures where per square kilometer, in India at least, we're looking at 500 to 700, 300 to 500 people, right? In some of the other areas in Japan, in Bangladesh, right, in these smaller spaces, the density is going to be much higher. Now, if we think about the levels of development, right, I think about maybe what goes into these stages, right, what else happens as a result of these stages. I also have to consider that in stage 4 and 5, I have low birth and low death rates, right? In my NICs, I have my low death rates, and the birth rates are declining. And in my LDCs, high birth and high death. Now, what that means for population growth is when I get to my MDC stage, I've already had lots of population growth, right? So my growth is stable or low. And that means that I have generally a high population, right? I've gone through all these stages as MDC. My NICs, I still have maybe medium to high birth rates, or which is also going to contribute to medium to high growth, right, of population. It's still booming. My stage 1 and my stage 2s, right, this transition is where we start to get this high growth. But here we also have stable or low growth, right? High and high, they cancel out. And these growth rates, while not directly contributing to the density, over time are going to increase density in these spaces. All right, so we know that the two largest spaces, two largest populations in the world consist of the Chinese national population and the Indian national population. The difference here, right, between being a darker shade or a lighter shade, because China and India are very close in population, is just a factor of the size of their relative spaces, right? China is just a larger country and is one of the largest countries. India's large, right? It's not small by any means, but it's definitely not as large of a country as China is. And that changes the densities, right? That changes those ratios. Now, aside from looking at these sources, right, because maybe this is going to be factors into why density is the way it is, right? Why we have so many people clustered in a space. Because in the NICs, that means that we're dealing with secondary sector stuff, which means we're dealing with manufacturing, and those manufacturing locations are in cities where people cluster and clump together. East Asia, we're looking at a lot of the same thing. It's a mix of MDC and NIC. We have countries like South Korea and Japan who are in this upper echelon of development. And then areas of China, where China is kind of, again, one of the tricky examples because it's so large, where it's hard to gauge its development. But on the coast, it's more MDC-like, right? It's more developed and has these special economic zones where it's brought in a lot of economic development. But we still have these other sparsely developed areas throughout the rest of the country. Southeast Asia, we have a lot of manufacturing, right? And these small spaces. If we think about Indonesia, right? These islands that are here, or Vietnam, it's very difficult to gauge a low population density because the spaces, again, are so small. Western Europe, these are our MDCs. And as we've seen, these spaces are also very, very small, right? We have smaller countries here, and that's going to contribute to larger densities, or a larger density ratio, rather. Now, aside from this, looking at my causes, right, because this is how I'm thinking through my population density, what I have to think about next, right, if I'm just looking at this single stimulus, is what this means for the environment, for the space in which people are living, right? That pillar of human geography, one of these big 5 themes, is human-environment interaction. So my question, and maybe one of my questions I have to answer if when I get FRQ, is how do high population densities affect or contribute to environmental impacts? Now, this is a question I ask myself, right? The actual question may be explain the environmental impact of high human population densities. And that may be like an FRQ type question that I receive, right? But this is the question I'm asking myself, right? How are these population densities going to affect the environment? What do large population densities do, right? How do they contribute to the way people interact and act in space? And at the very least, right, the thing when we think about, the thing that comes up when we think about high population densities is going to be overpopulation. Right, that itself is not an answer, right? That's just one of these next steps that happens. What I have to think about next is, well, what does overpopulation do, right? What does that lead to over time? And for overpopulation, well, I know that we have crowding, right? And we have too many people in one space. And the formal human geography term would be, right, a population that exceeds the carrying capacity of the environment. Right. That might be our, human geography definition for it. But again, that itself is not an answer. That's just help framing my response. So what I have to go on next to say, okay, well, what happens when I have too many people? What happens when I do exceed that carrying capacity, right? And from then on, it may be, well, now there's a lack of resources, right? And those resources could be things like water, food, shelter, job availability. And these things lead to other things, right? It's all this kind of cascading sort of information flow that we have to think about. Now, from then on, well, okay, lack of resources, not enough water. Well, that could mean that people are, right, under or malnourished, right? Which is a health effect of overpopulation, right? And health effects, right, could be social because it affects people, or it could be environmental because those health effects aren't just going to affect the person themselves, the individual, but it's going to spread and it's going to affect people around these individuals too, right? Having no shelter, job availability, right? That may lead to low, not economic development as a whole, but that may contribute, right, to poverty, right, or to an increased ratio or an increased difference, rather increased disparity, right, which is going to be a large difference in economic status among individuals, right? And that's also one of these factors that we see in NICs and LDCs, is that we tend to see these large spaces between the highest percentage of income earners and the lowest percent of income earners, right? And if we don't have enough space, not enough crowding, where the space is not just physical space where you live, but also the resources available to you in that space, we can have all these separate effects that happen too. Now, I know it seems like a lot, but a lot of this is not stuff that I would write down, right? I'm not going to be writing down this stuff as I plan my FRQ. A lot of this I'm hoping to have in my head, right, where I'm thinking through the FRQ, thinking through whatever prompt I have, and so this is the information I want to have in mind. Now, maybe my questions won't have to deal with the actual population densities or the source for these population densities, and that's okay. What this video is trying to work through is what sort of thinking you want to have kind of on the back burner. So when you approach a question like this on population density or anything having to do with population, you want to make the right connections, right? Or you want to be able to jump through the right sorts of hoops to get to an answer. All of this information is stuff we've looked at, right? Stuff that's in notes, stuff that's in the YouTube review, that's in the files on Teams. All of these things are available to you for review. It's just a matter of having this on hand, right? Here at the bottom, right, how do high population densities affect? This question may answer a lot of different questions for me, right? This would be kind of the be-all, end-all, right? This is what I want as kind of my final route to an answer. All right, so if I'm going to type something like this out, and I'm going to answer this question, right, how do high population densities affect or contribute to environmental impacts? Well, I can start with my answer. Overpopulation is a result, or rather can be a result, of high population density. Overpopulation is when the population in a space exceeds the carrying capacity of that space. One impact of overpopulation is that there may be a lack of resources such as food or water. This can lead to those without means to collect or gather food and water to become malnourished. And here's at least one kind of lane I can take, right? And I just went through this first lane here, right? Lack of resources, food, water, shelter availability. And I had two different effects that I'd already identified, not because I was trying to identify them, but because I was just thinking through the answers. Now, if I want to make this to an FRQ type question, right, I can separate things out here, because this question might answer something like, define overpopulation. Right, and maybe that's one of my first questions. Well, that first sentence, that takes care of that, because I already had thought through what overpopulation is. Maybe my next sentence is something like, describe one impact of overpopulation, right, or high population densities. Here I can bring back that sentence that I had just deleted, right, overpopulation can be a result of high population densities. And then I have my impact here, all right? If I want a second impact, I have this other one, all right? So maybe this is going to be one social or environmental impact. And here all I have to do is add onto my response, right? One health impact of, or rather one social impact overpopulation is that there being a lack of resources such as food as water. All right, this can lead to those, that means to collect or gather food to become malnourished. This malnourishment negatively impacts the health of these individuals, right? And here I have a full FRQ response. A lot of this is just thinking through the question itself so that I have an idea of where I want to go with this topic. And again, this is not all things that I'm going to write down, right? These are not all things that I want to have on my page or like on a scratch sheet of paper or something like that. But this is the kind of information I want to have available to me, right? The kind of information that I want to have presented to me in this way. That does it for our first stimulus. For our first example stimulus of the week in terms of breaking down FRQs. We're going to have another video on this next topic, right, what we call agricultural density. That'll be the second video that you can watch in this series. Hopefully this is helpful to you. Again, feel free to reach out to me with any questions, concerns you may have. And as always, here's hoping you're happy, healthy, and safe.